We must face the fact that we as a people, and I'll put it this way, let me put it this way, I often say it this way and I'll say it again. In order for us to be in the position we're in as people, we have to be crazy. We have to be out of our minds. We have to be in a state of deception and off our centers. It is not possible for the European, who is about 10% of the world's population, to rule over the other 90% of the world's population unless that 90% is crazy and out of its mind. It is not possible for the European who inhabits lands that are not wealthy in their natural resources, and yet to be seen as the world's wealthiest people, and our peoples who inhabit the lands with abundant natural resources to be seen as the world's poorest people. For us to be in that position unless we are out of our minds as people. In other words, then, being crazy and being out of our minds, being maladjusted, whatever word you want to call it, is a political necessity for the European system to survive. It could not survive otherwise. And we must recognize that as the foundation of our situation, the necessity of the European to keep us out of our mind and to keep us maladjusted as a people. Therefore, the liberation of African man and the liberation of the world in general essentially involves the liberation from this state of craziness that we've been put into, and recognizing it and determining how we can escape it. For once we escape this state of mind that has been imposed upon us by political and other means, we then will begin to achieve what I call our liberation. You can imagine for a moment how important it is for us to have a perception of reality, an efficient one, the ability to really perceive what is going on and to sense what is going on. Imagine for a moment that you've lost your sight and see in what way that influences your ability to deal with reality. Imagine then a little later you lose your hearing. Then you lose your feelings. You lose your taste. You lose your smell. You lose your ability to feel your own body. How then can you cope with reality? Can you really be human, having lost all of your senses? You would literally have to be taken care of and guided by someone else. A person then who could not feel his body, could not see, could not hear, could not taste. He's an individual, of course, who by no means is going to be able to cope efficiently with reality, except perhaps through the very needed help of others. In a sense, then, when we look at our situation in this country and in the world in general, we, to a good extent, have been made inefficient in our perception of reality by the European. To a good extent, then, when we look at the history of the African man in relationship to the European, we see a man whose reality has been created for him, whose mind and brain has been created in such a way that even the most obvious things in reality are overlooked and not seen. And this is often done through what we call this so-called education. Remember, I alluded to the idea of trained eyes, experienced eyes, which means that an individual's mind has been created so that the eyes can find what that individual is looking for. What makes you think then that the European who trains your mind is going to train your mind to see reality in such a way that it will overthrow his dominance over you as a people? How do you expect to see reality from a people who write your history in such a way that you don't even see yourself there? So when you look at history, you're not there. You look at American history, you're not there. You look at world history, you're not there. You look at anthropology, you're not there. And if you are there, you're there as a primitive, Stone Age kind of people, never having written anything or contributed anything. You look at economics, and you're not there, except perhaps as a commodity in and of itself. You look at mathematics, and you're not there. You look at every discipline, and you do not see yourself. What kind of reality, then, can we be looking at as a people when our minds have been trained in such a way that we have literally negative hallucinations? So we must recognize then that these kind of people cannot lay a correct perception of reality upon us as a people. And we must recognize that the very educated among them are the very ones who are responsible to a great degree for creating the distorted reality we face today. We have to recognize that knowledge in and of itself does not represent the salvation of mankind. If you're a Christian out there and you really want to test your faith, after you get through reading the Bible, read the history of the Christian religion. Read the history of the popes. Read the history of the wars and death born in the name of so-called God. Read the history of a priest on one side praying that his army will chop to pieces the army on the other side, with the priest praying on the other side that his army chops the other one to pieces. Read the history of these people, of the priests who enslaved your own people. Read the history of the popes who gave their people permission to enslave us and to put us away. How then can you expect this people to give you an efficient perception of reality? Then we must recognize then that our very first problem as a people is that of perceiving reality for what it is and dealing with it for what it is. For if you do not deal with reality for what it is, then you can only be dealing with fantasies and hallucinations and illusions. And if you deal with fantasies, hallucinations, and illusions, then you will stumble about as a blind people and will be unable to solve the problems that confront us. One of the major reasons then we have such difficulty in solving the problems that confront us as a people and in dealing with our own liberation is because we are operating from a false reality. And therefore lying and deception must be a characteristic of the European in order to maintain the world as it is today. If not knowing, if not being able to perceive what is going on in the outside reality cripples us, makes us stumble over reality, makes us inefficient in coping with that reality, then not knowing ourselves also creates the same kind of problem. Hence, we fall over our own minds, our own sense of self, in our own being. We have to recognize when we looked at the African man in slavery that the African could not be an African and a slave at the same time. You can't be an African and a slave at the same time. You cannot be a real black African person and be under the control of the European at the same time. Therefore, the slave master recognized this right away. And consequently, he set to work immediately to remove the African nature from the African person. Which means then if he removed the African nature, he took away the self-knowledge necessary for that individual to define himself. He took away the values, took away the cultural mores and ethics, the cultural way of perceiving and dealing with reality. He took away then the self-definition. That is why, of course, we don't find ourselves in this. That is why the anthropology distorts perception of the African. That is why economics is not adequately explained in terms, in relationship to our people. That is why the religion is distorted and used against us. We've told you many times that you have to recognize that the Europeans' position depends upon the subordination of the African peoples. And consequently, every institution in the European system has as its center the maintaining of the status quo. That is why I've often said everything has to be reversed when it comes to the African person. When you send your children to school, they must be made dumb in the same school that the white child is made smart in.